You are standing at the door of a bedroom in La Herradura. La Herradura is not just a neighborhood. In Mexico, La Herradura is a statement. It is a gated, private residential development in Naucalpan, Estado de Mexico, just northwest of Mexico City, where the houses are large enough to have names instead of just addresses, where the security booths at the entrance are staffed 24 hours a day, where the dogs are purebred and the cars are imported and the lawns are watered on a schedule. La Herradura is the kind of place that people in Mexico City point to when they talk about money that doesn't need to announce itself, because the gate at the entrance announces it for you. The bedroom you are standing in front of belongs to a 4-year-old girl named Paulette Gabarra Farah. It is nighttime. It is the night of March 22, bleeding into the early morning hours of March 23, 2010. The house is quiet in the specific way that expensive houses are quiet. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of insulation, of thick walls and double-glazed windows and carpeted floors that absorb the sound of footsteps before they can become evidence of anything. Push open the door. The room is what you would expect and also, if you look carefully, a little more than that. There are toys. There are colors, warm ones, cheerful ones, the deliberate palette of a child's space designed by someone who had resources to spend on deliberateness. There is a bed with railings on the sides, which is not standard for a 4-year-old but is entirely appropriate for this particular 4-year-old, because Paulette has a condition called congenital hypotonia, which means that her muscles, all of them, throughout her body, produce less tension than they should. Less grip. Less control. Less ability to catch herself when she falls, to move quickly when she needs to navigate her environment in the dark without help. The bed railings exist because Paulette needed them. The rest of the room exists the way children's rooms exist, as a record of who someone is becoming. The specific toys she preferred. The books. The things she liked to touch and hold. A life at the very beginning of itself, organized into a space that was hers. Now look at the closet. It is on the far wall. Standard dimensions. A closet that, in any house, in any bedroom, would be unremarkable. A closet that was opened and searched on the morning of March 23, 2010, when Paulette's mother reported that her daughter was missing. A closet that was opened and searched again in the days that followed, as investigators came and went and the case grew louder in the national media. A closet that, on March 31, 2010, 9 days after Paulette was reported missing, was found to contain the body of a 4-year-old girl, wrapped in the sheets from her own bed. 9 days. That number is the center of this entire story. Everything radiates outward from it. Every question, every contradiction, every silence that was maintained when it should have been broken and every statement that was made when silence would have been more honest, all of it orbits around those 9 days and the thing that was or wasn't in the closet during them. We are going to take this apart carefully. We are going to lay every piece out in the light and look at it directly, the way you look at something you don't fully understand but cannot look away from. Because Paulette Gabarra Farah was a real child who was killed by a real person. And that person has never been convicted. And Mexico, for all its noise and all its outrage and all its weeks of round-the-clock news coverage, moved on. This is an attempt to not move on. She is 4 years old and she has a way of smiling that uses her entire body. This is what the people who knew her say, separately, in different contexts, without having coordinated the description, that when Paulette Gabarra Farah smiled, it wasn't just her face that participated. It was her shoulders and her hands and the way she held herself in space. She didn't have the fine motor control that other 4-year-olds have developed by that age, so the expressions that other children might contain in a precise, practiced way radiated outward from her in a kind of full-body declaration. Joy, for Paulette, was a whole-body event. She was born on January 12, 2006, in Mexico City, into a family with money and the specific complications that money sometimes generates. Her father, Michel Gabarra, was a businessman of Lebanese descent. Her mother, Lizette Farah, was a woman who had grown up in a world where aesthetics mattered and appearances were managed, and the line between what was shown publicly and what existed privately was maintained with considerable effort. Together they had 2 other children, Lizette's sons from a previous relationship, older than Paulette, part of the blended architecture of a modern family. By the time Paulette was 4, her parents' marriage was in the process of ending. Not explosively. Or at least, not in any way that had become visible to outsiders. But ending, the way things end when 2 people have decided that the arrangement no longer works and have begun the long, painful, legally complicated process of extracting themselves from each other while remaining, for practical purposes, in the same house. Paulette lived in this. The way children live in the atmospheres created by adult decisions. Without full understanding, but with a body that registers tension the way a barometer registers pressure. She didn't have the language to articulate what the household felt like in those months. She had 4 years of vocabulary and a nervous system that absorbed everything. Her hypotonia shaped her daily experience in ways that are important to understand clearly, because they will matter enormously to everything that follows. Congenital hypotonia is not a disease. It is a condition of the muscles, a kind of low baseline tension that means the body doesn't respond to the commands the brain sends with the same speed or force that it does in people without the condition. For Paulette, this meant that walking was an effort. That navigating stairs required concentration and assistance. That moving through her environment independently, especially in conditions of reduced visibility, was significantly more difficult than it would be for a child her age without the condition. She was not helpless. She was not immobile. She could walk. She could play. She had her preferences and her opinions and the specific, fierce individual will of a 4-year-old who knows what she wants. But she needed help with things that other children her age were beginning to handle alone. She needed someone to be attentive to where she was and what she was trying to do. In the household at La Herradura, that someone was primarily Esperanza Martinez, the family's nanny. Esperanza had been with the family for years, long enough to know the rhythms of the house, the rhythms of each child, the specific ways in which Paulette needed to be attended to that were different from the needs of the older boys. Long enough to know what Paulette's normal looked like, and therefore what abnormal would look like too. There is a photograph of Paulette that became ubiquitous during the 9 days of her disappearance. It was printed on flyers. It was shown on television continuously, the way that photographs of missing children are shown, as evidence that the person existed, as an argument for their return. In the photograph, she is smiling in the way that people who knew her described. All of her, not just her face. She is looking at the camera with the particular directness of very young children, who have not yet learned to modulate their gaze for an audience. She looks, in that photograph, like a child who is entirely present in the world. Entirely real. Entirely here. And then, one morning, she wasn't. What follows is a reconstruction of the morning of March 23, 2010, based on official declarations, subsequent investigative reporting, and publicly available information from the judicial proceedings. Approximately 6:40 a.m. Lizette Farah goes to Paulette's bedroom to wake her daughter. The bed is empty. The bedding is disturbed in a way that might suggest Paulette got up during the night, or might suggest other things entirely, depending on what questions one brings to the observation. Lizette searches the room briefly. Paulette is not under the bed. Paulette is not in the attached bathroom. The closet is, at this point, either opened and found empty, or not yet opened. This detail will become significant. Approximately 6:45 a.m. Lizette moves through the house. She checks the adjacent rooms. She checks the hallway. She wakes her other children, or at least checks their rooms. Paulette is not there. Approximately 6:50 a.m. The household staff is alerted. Security personnel for the property are contacted. La Herradura operates as a gated community with a staffed entrance booth. The guards at the booth are asked about overnight activity. Their logs show no unauthorized entry or exit during the night. No gate was opened between approximately midnight and 6 in the morning that was not accounted for by a registered resident. This is important. It means that according to the security records, nothing came in and nothing went out. Approximately 7:15 a.m. Michel Gabarra, Paulette's father, is reached by phone. He is traveling outside the city, a fact that will later be confirmed by documentation. He begins making arrangements to return. Approximately 8 a.m. The decision is made to report the disappearance to authorities. Lizette Farah, along with other members of the household or legal representatives, goes to the Ministerio Público, the Mexican public prosecutor's office, in Naucalpan to file a formal missing persons report. Approximately 8:30 a.m. The formal report is filed. Paulette Gabarra Farah, female, 4 years old, dark hair, diagnosed with congenital hypotonia affecting her mobility, was last seen in her bedroom the night before and cannot be located. A report number is assigned. The case, at this point, is a missing child case. Approximately 10 a.m. The first investigators from the Procuraduría General de Justicia del Estado de Mexico, the state of Mexico's equivalent of a district attorney's office, arrive at the property. They begin their initial assessment. The house is large. There are multiple rooms, multiple floors, a garden, outbuildings. The systematic search of the property begins. Approximately 10:30 a.m. Investigators reach Paulette's bedroom. Standard procedure, every room is checked, every possible hiding place assessed. The closet in Paulette's room is opened. Investigators report finding nothing. That sentence, investigators report finding nothing, is the sentence around which the entire case revolves. It will need to be returned to. Repeatedly. Afternoon of March 23. The search extends beyond the property. Neighbors are questioned. The security footage from the entrance booth is reviewed. The surrounding streets, the green spaces within La Herradura's perimeter, are searched. Nothing. The news breaks publicly by the afternoon. The photograph of Paulette, the one where she's smiling with her whole body, begins to circulate. The 9 days have begun. In the days following Paulette's disappearance, her mother, Lizette Farah, spoke to the media. She spoke often. She spoke at length. She appeared on multiple broadcasts, gave interviews to multiple print journalists, participated in the kind of saturating media presence that is both a tool of genuine appeal, please, if anyone knows anything, please, and a performance that the public inevitably watches through a double lens. We watch the content of what is said, and we watch the person saying it. We cannot help doing both at once. What the Mexican public saw, across those days of footage and photographs, generated a response that was swift and largely unified. People did not believe her. That is worth sitting with carefully before going any further. Because the fact that people didn't believe Lizette Farah is not evidence that she was lying. Human beings are notoriously poor at detecting deception through behavioral cues. Study after study in the field of behavioral psychology has demonstrated that people consistently overestimate their ability to detect lies, and that the behavioral signals we most commonly associate with deception, averting the gaze, covering the mouth, speaking in a halting or unnatural way, are not actually reliable indicators of dishonesty. They are, more often, indicators of stress. And stress can be generated by a great many things, including grief. And yet, there are specific aspects of Lizette Farah's media appearances during those 9 days that were noted, repeatedly and independently, by journalists, behavioral experts who offered commentary to various outlets, and an enormous number of ordinary viewers who found themselves unable to articulate precisely what unsettled them, but could not get past the feeling that something was not right. The first was affect. Affect, in psychological terms, refers to the outward expression of internal emotional states. In most cases of genuine parental grief over a missing child, the effect is overwhelming and difficult to contain. Parents of missing children, in interviews, often cannot complete sentences. They break. They stop mid-thought because the thought has taken them somewhere they cannot go on camera. The grief is not performed. It erupts at unpredictable intervals, interrupts the narrative, refuses to be organized. Lizette's effect, in her early appearances, was controlled in a way that viewers registered as unusual. Tears appeared at certain moments, and they were real tears, there was no doubt about that. But they appeared and retreated with a tidiness that felt rehearsed to many observers. They did not overwhelm her. They did not break her apart. They arrived, performed their function, and then the composure returned. This, by itself, means nothing definitive. Effect varies enormously between individuals. People who grow up in certain social environments learn to regulate their emotional expression as a matter of survival, as a matter of class performance, as a matter of the specific culture of dignity and self-presentation that exists in families with money and social standing. Lizette Farah had grown up in that culture. She knew how to be seen. That knowledge does not make someone a murderer. But there was also the matter of content. Not just how she said things, but what she said. In several interviews, when asked about Paulette, Lizette's descriptions had a quality that analysts would later describe as abstract, as if she were describing a case she had read about rather than a child she had put to bed the night before. The language was often general where specific language would be expected. The emotional specificity, the particular details that come involuntarily when a parent is trying to convey the unique, irreplaceable reality of their child to an audience, was sometimes missing. There was one interview, widely circulated online, in which the journalist asks Lizette directly, "Do you have a message for Paulette?" Lizette pauses. She looks down. Then she looks at the camera. And then she speaks, calmly, in full sentences, the kind of message that a publicist might draft for a client in crisis management mode. It was the right words. It was not the right delivery for the right words. None of this is proof of anything. All of it made Mexico deeply uncomfortable. And Mexico, having nothing else to do with that discomfort, decided. We will return to the question of what Mexico decided, and what that decision meant, and what it cost. But first we have to understand what was happening inside the investigation, not in front of the cameras, but in the rooms the cameras didn't see. Let's think about what a search looks like. Not the dramatized version, where investigators sweep through a space with confident authority and find what they need in Act 2. The real version. A real search of a residential property, in a missing child case, in Mexico, in 2010. What does that actually involve? It involves people walking through rooms. It involves opening doors and looking inside. It involves getting down and checking under furniture, moving things that might conceivably conceal a small body, checking every space large enough to hold a 4-year-old child who, because of her hypotonia, might not be able to call out loudly enough to be heard through a closed door. It involves, in cases with sufficient resources, trained search dogs. It involves systematic repetition. Checking the same spaces more than once, because the first pass can miss things. The property at La Herradura was searched. Multiple times. By multiple investigators. At least once by individuals trained specifically for this purpose. The result, reported officially, was that Paulette was not found on the premises. And then, 9 days later, she was found in the closet of her own bedroom. This is not a minor discrepancy. This is not a procedural detail that can be smoothed over with bureaucratic language about challenging conditions and large search areas. This is the central factual impossibility of the case, the thing that all other questions orbit. How does a child's body remain in a residential closet, in a house being actively searched, for 9 days without being found? There are, in principle, 2 answers to this question. The first answer is that she was there the entire time, and the searches were so inadequate, so negligent, so thoroughly compromised by incompetence or interference, that nobody noticed. This is possible. Mexican law enforcement at the state level has a documented history of investigative failures that would strain credibility if they were fiction. Searches can be rushed. Procedures can be skipped. In cases where powerful families are involved, investigators sometimes find reasons not to look too carefully. The second answer is that she was not there for the first several days. That her body was moved into the closet at some point after the initial searches, possibly days later, and that someone knew she would be found when they placed her there. This explanation is more disturbing in its implications, because it requires a level of planning and nerve that is difficult to contemplate. But it is not logically impossible. It is, in fact, what a significant portion of both the public and some analysts came to believe. Now let us add the detail of the search dog. It was reported, and not subsequently refuted in any official capacity, that a trained cadaver dog, a dog trained specifically to detect human remains, was used during the search of the property. Search dogs of this kind are remarkably effective. They detect the specific chemical signatures produced by decomposition, and they can detect these signatures through walls, through closet doors, through wrapped fabric. The sensitivity of a trained cadaver dog's nose is not a matter of debate in forensic science. These animals work, consistently and reliably, and they work on timescales that are relevant to this case. No dog alert was publicly confirmed for the area of Paulette's closet during the days when she was supposedly not there. This requires one of two explanations. Either the dog was used and found nothing because there was nothing to find, which supports the theory that the body was placed there later, or the dog was used, found something, and that finding was not reported or acted upon, which opens an entirely different category of problem. Neither explanation is comfortable. Neither has been fully addressed by the official investigation. Now add the question of state of decomposition. When Paulette's body was recovered on March 31st, it had been dead long enough to show significant decomposition. The forensic examiners would need to assess whether that decomposition was consistent with 9 days of death, which would put the time of death at approximately the night of the disappearance, or whether it suggested a different timeline. The results of that assessment were, and this is a word chosen deliberately, murky. The forensic reports, as they became available through journalistic reporting and partial disclosure of the judicial record, contained language that did not produce a clean answer. The condition of the body was consistent with several different timelines, none definitively excluded. Which meant that the forensic evidence neither conclusively proved the 9-day theory nor conclusively disproved it. In a criminal case, ambiguity of this kind is not neutral. It is a gift to the defense and a catastrophe for the prosecution. Someone knew that. Someone may have relied on it. On March 31, 2010, the body of Paulette Gabarra Farah was found in the closet of her bedroom. The body was wrapped in the sheets from her bed. This detail, the sheets, is one of the most significant in the case, and it is one that received less attention than it deserved in the immediate media coverage, which was focused, understandably, on the bare fact of the discovery. But the sheets matter. They matter because they tell us something about the circumstances of the death and the aftermath. The sheets from Paulette's own bed were used to wrap her body. This means that whoever wrapped her had access to her bed. Had access to the room. Had time, not just seconds, but enough time to remove the sheets, wrap a body, and place it in the closet in a way that, according to investigators, was not immediately obvious as a human body to someone opening the closet door. That takes longer than a moment of panicked violence. The body was transported to the forensic medicine facility of the state of Mexico, where an autopsy was performed by medical examiners under the jurisdiction of the Procuraduría. The autopsy had one primary task: determine cause of death and, as closely as possible, time of death. The cause of death was determined to be mechanical asphyxiation. In plain terms, someone had obstructed Paulette's airways in a sustained manner until she was dead. This is not something that can result from an accidental fall, from the effects of her hypotonia, from choking on food, from any of the natural or accidental causes that might provide a family with a different narrative. This determination was clear and it was not subsequently disputed in any credible way. Paulette Gabarra Farah was murdered. She was killed deliberately, by someone who pressed against her throat or covered her face or otherwise cut off her access to oxygen until her body stopped. She weighed approximately 17 kilograms. She was 4 years old. She could not walk fast. She could not run. She could not have escaped. The time of death was more problematic. Forensic pathologists determine time of death through a combination of factors. Body temperature at discovery, the rate of decomposition observed in the tissues, the presence or absence of rigor mortis, the state of the internal organs, entomological evidence, the activity of insects on and within the remains, and other markers. Each of these produces an estimate with a margin of error, and when those margins are combined, the resulting window can be quite wide. In Paulette's case, the decomposition was already advanced enough that the window produced by the forensic examination was wider than investigators had hoped. The official findings were consistent with a death occurring anywhere from several days to over a week before discovery, which meant that the data did not contradict the mother's account of Paulette being alive on the night of March 22, but also did not confirm it. What the body could not tell investigators, and what the forensic science of 2010 in the Estado de Mexico could not resolve with certainty, was whether Paulette died the night she was reported missing, or at some other time before her body was placed in that closet. What the body could tell them, clearly, unambiguously, in the language that forensic medicine speaks best, was that this child was killed by another person. That the killing was close. That whoever did it was close to her, physically, in the final moments of her life. In a house with a small number of inhabitants and a gated perimeter that showed no signs of breach, close to her, physically, is not a broad category. It is, in fact, an extremely narrow one. In any criminal investigation, contradictions are not automatically evidence of guilt. People misremember. People perceive things differently. People under stress make statements that are inaccurate not because they are lying but because their minds, under pressure, are unreliable narrators of their own experience. This is established psychology. This is important to keep in mind. What follows is a catalogue of the contradictions that emerged in the case of Paulette Gabarra Farah. They are presented not as proof of anything, but as a record of the questions that the investigation raised and never adequately resolved. Contradiction 1. The girl who couldn't walk alone. Statement: Paulette got up during the night and left her room unassisted. What the facts complicate: Paulette had congenital hypotonia. Her motor control was reduced. Moving through a dark house at night, without assistance, would have been significantly more difficult for her than for a 4-year-old without her condition. The family was aware of this. The bed railings existed specifically because of her condition. There is a meaningful question about how likely it was that a child with Paulette's specific physical limitations would independently navigate her environment in the dark, without making enough noise to alert anyone in a house with multiple adults present. Contradiction 2, the closet that was empty. Statement: the closet in Paulette's bedroom was searched in the initial investigation and found to contain nothing. What the facts complicate. 9 days later, the same closet contained the body of a 4-year-old wrapped in sheets. Either the body was there throughout and was not found, which requires a level of investigative failure that is remarkable, or the body was not there and was placed there later, which requires a level of planning and access that is its own kind of remarkable. Contradiction 3, the dog that didn't alert. Statement: a trained search dog was deployed during the search of the property. What the facts complicate: trained cadaver dogs detect decomposition through barriers, walls, closed doors, fabric wrapping. A body that had been in that closet for several days would have been detectable to a properly trained animal. The absence of a reported alert from the search dog is either evidence that the body was not there during the search, or evidence of a procedural failure in how the dog was deployed, or evidence that the alert occurred and was not followed up properly. Contradiction 4, the sounds of a silent night. Statement: Nobody in the household heard anything unusual during the night of March 22 to 23. What the facts complicate: a child with hypotonia being subjected to mechanical asphyxiation would not be entirely silent. While hypotonia affects muscle tone generally, it does not eliminate the capacity to make sound. The vocalization of a small child in distress tends to be audible. The house, while large, is not a compound. There were adults in the building. The nanny slept in the house. Contradiction 5, the family atmosphere. Statement: the family, though in the process of separation, functioned without significant incident. What the facts complicate: Michel Gabarra, in his own statements and in subsequent reporting, described a household environment in the period before Paulette's death that was significantly more tense than the version initially presented. Questions about custody. Specifically, about who would have primary custody of Paulette given her special needs and the complexity of those needs, had been a source of ongoing conflict. The question of who was better positioned to care for a child with hypotonia is the kind of question that generates profound, sometimes desperate emotional stakes. Contradiction 6, the mother who found her. Statement: on March 31, it was Lisette Farah herself who found Paulette's body in the closet. What the facts complicate. Lisette had reportedly opened or been present when the closet was opened during earlier searches. She had been in that room. She had been in the house throughout the 9 days of searching. The fact that it was she who ultimately discovered the body, and the closet, raises questions about what she knew, and when she knew it, that the investigation never resolved to a standard that permitted prosecution. Esperanza Martinez had learned, over years of working in houses like the one in La Herradura, to be invisible in the specific way that domestic workers in Mexico learn to be invisible. Not literally invisible, she was there, present, a daily fixture of the household in the way that a piece of furniture is a daily fixture. But invisible in terms of perspective. In terms of being a person with thoughts and observations and a full interior life that the family around her did not inquire about, because it did not occur to them to inquire, because the architecture of that employer-employee relationship is built on the presumption that the person who takes care of your children is fully present for the management of their needs and only approximately present as a human being with opinions of her own. Esperanza had been with the family long enough to know Paulette completely. She knew the way Paulette moved, which was careful and deliberate, each step a small negotiation with gravity. She knew the way Paulette communicated, which was expressive and emphatic in the way of children who cannot always articulate in words what they need, and have learned to make their needs legible through other means. She knew the sounds Paulette made in the night. The small adjustments, the occasional restlessness that would resolve itself without intervention, and the different sounds, the ones that required attention, that meant Paulette had moved to an uncomfortable position or needed help that she couldn't provide for herself. She had been with Paulette the evening of March 22. She had bathed her. She had given her dinner. She had helped her into bed, which was a ritual that had its specific steps. The particular order in which the blankets were arranged, the way the railings on the bed were checked, the good night that Paulette expected in a specific form. Esperanza had been through this ritual hundreds of times. She knew it the way she knew her own breathing. On the night of March 22, by her account, Paulette had been fine. Not unusually agitated. Not ill. Not distressed in any way that differed from her baseline. A child settling into sleep in the specific way that she settled into sleep. Esperanza went to bed. She slept in the house. This is also significant. The question of what Esperanza heard, or didn't hear, during the night is one of the questions that the investigation raised and the public asked and the subsequent proceedings explored. A domestic worker sleeping in the house would have access, in terms of proximity, to information about what happened in that house during the night. They would hear things that the walls of a house conduct. The sounds that move through a residential structure in the small hours of the morning, when the ambient noise of the day has reduced to a minimum, are often more audible than people realize. What Esperanza's testimony contained on this point was, in the publicly available information from the case, ambiguous. What she said she heard, or didn't hear, has not been reported with the specificity that would allow a clear account here. What is documented is that she was interviewed by investigators, multiple times, and that her testimony was part of the record. What her testimony could not resolve, what no single testimony could resolve, was the question of what happened in the hours between when she put Paulette to bed and when Lizette Farah walked into that room in the morning. Those hours exist in a gap. A gap of the specific kind that criminal investigations sometimes create when they are not conducted with maximum rigor, a space where the truth lived but was never adequately retrieved. Esperanza knew Paulette. She knew the sounds of that house at night. She knew what Paulette's nighttime sounded like when it was normal and when it was not. What she knew about the night of March 22 has never been fully made public. And what we cannot hear, we cannot evaluate. Michel Gabarra was not at home when his daughter disappeared. This is a fact. It is documented, it was verified by investigators, and it places him in a category that is distinct from everyone else in this story. He has a geographic alibi for the night of March 22 to 23, 2010. He was not in La Herradura. He was not in the house. He could not have been the person in the room with Paulette during whatever happened that night. That much is established. What is less established? What exists in the murkier territory of media reporting, legal proceedings, and the competing accounts that emerge whenever a marriage ends badly, is the picture of the household in the weeks before Paulette died. And Michel Gabarra's statements about that picture are an important part of the record, not because they point to his culpability, but because they point to conditions that are directly relevant to understanding what the atmosphere of that house was like. In his public appearances during the investigation and the legal proceedings that followed, Michel Gabarra's behavior was notably different from Lizette's. Where she was controlled, he appeared broken. Where her emotional expression raised questions in the minds of observers, his seemed to match the weight of what he was describing. He spoke about Paulette in the way of someone who is trying to make a lost person present through language, and cannot quite do it, and the failure is right there in every sentence. He spoke about the custody dispute. In the dissolution of their marriage, Paulette was both the most straightforward and the most complicated element. Most straightforward because she was a child and children, in theory, are a matter of determining what is best for them and allocating responsibility accordingly. Most complicated because Paulette's hypotonia made the question of what is best for her more acute, more specific, and more contested than it would be for a child without her condition. The established record, Michel Gabarra stated, in multiple contexts, that the family atmosphere in the period before Paulette's death was marked by significant conflict over custody. That the question of Paulette's care was contested. That the household environment was not the stable, functional co-parenting arrangement that the initial public narrative had suggested. The speculative record, media coverage during the height of the case's public attention contained numerous reports, analyses, and claims about the family dynamic that ranged from plausible to obviously sensationalized. Some accounts described domestic tensions in stark terms. Others were more measured. The challenge of evaluating these accounts is that they were produced in the context of a case that had already generated a popular verdict, and popular verdicts exert gravitational pull on the information that orbits them. What can be said with confidence about Michel Gabarra is this. He was a man who lost his daughter under circumstances that he did not control, that he could not prevent because he was physically elsewhere, and that the subsequent investigation never resolved to his satisfaction or to the standard of justice. He lived publicly through his grief in ways that the viewing public read as authentic. Whether that reading was accurate is something only he knows. What can be said with confidence about the marriage, and the custody dispute, and the atmosphere of the house in the weeks before March 22, is that these things were not what they were initially presented to be. That much, at least, is not in dispute by any of the principals. There is a way of measuring how well a criminal investigation has functioned, and it is ruthlessly simple: you look at what it produced. The investigation into the death of Paulette Gabarra Farah was conducted by the Procuraduría General de Justicia del Estado de Mexico, the Attorney General's Office of the State of Mexico. This institution is responsible for criminal investigations within the state's jurisdiction, and the state of Mexico, which wraps around Mexico City on three sides, is home to approximately 16 million people and a significant proportion of the country's most visible criminal cases. What did the investigation into Paulette's death produce? No conviction. 14 years after a 4-year-old was found dead of mechanical asphyxiation in her own home, in a house with a limited number of people present, in a gated community where unauthorized access was controlled and documented, no one has been convicted of her murder. That is the result. That is what the machinery of the Estado de Mexico's criminal justice system produced after years of investigation, proceedings, detentions, releases, appeals, and public attention. Nothing. To understand how this is possible, not to excuse it, but to understand it, requires looking at several intersecting factors. The evidence problem. Mexican criminal procedure in 2010 was in the midst of significant reforms. The country was transitioning from an inquisitorial legal system, in which the investigation and the prosecution were largely managed by the same institution, to an adversarial system modeled more closely on international standards. This transition was incomplete at the time of Paulette's case, which means that the procedural framework being applied was a hybrid, not fully one thing or the other, with all the gaps and ambiguities that hybrids tend to create. The evidence in Paulette's case had problems. The forensic evidence of the time of death was inconclusive. The chain of custody for physical evidence from the scene had been questioned. The investigative actions of the first days, when the scene was still fresh and the evidence most recoverable, had been conducted in ways that subsequent analysis found lacking. Whether this was incompetence, negligence, or something more deliberate is a question that the investigation itself was poorly positioned to answer, since the investigation is the thing being questioned. The class problem. The family had resources. Resources, in the Mexican legal system as in most legal systems, translate into legal representation of a quality that creates very different outcomes from the representation available to defendants without money. Access to expert witnesses who could contest forensic findings. Access to procedural maneuvers that could delay, complicate, and ultimately frustrate a prosecution. Access to the kind of sustained, skilled advocacy that is simply not available to most people. This is not a uniquely Mexican phenomenon. It is a global one. But in Mexico, in 2010, in the Estado de Mexico specifically, the differential was particularly stark. The gap between what money could buy in terms of legal protection and what the state could produce in terms of prosecution was wide enough to drive a case through. The attention problem. The case received enormous public attention in the immediate aftermath of the discovery. That attention has a paradoxical effect. It creates pressure on investigators to produce results quickly, and quickly produced results in criminal cases are often poorly constructed. Shortcuts are taken. Declarations are made to cameras that constrain the investigation's options. Pressure to arrest becomes pressure to charge becomes pressure that, when the charges don't hold, becomes the very mechanism by which someone walks free. Lizette Farah was detained. She was released. The charges that were brought did not result in conviction. The sequence of that process, the detention, the release, the procedural cycle, played out in the press in real time, and the press coverage created its own pressures and its own distortions. The institutional problem. The Procuraduría del Estado de Mexico is not, by any objective measure, a highly effective criminal justice institution. Its clearance rate, the percentage of cases that result in prosecution and conviction, is not distinguished. Its history of handling high-profile cases involving wealthy families is not reassuring. There are credible accounts, from journalists who have covered the institution for years, of cases that were managed in ways that favored those with connections or resources. These accounts are not proven in any individual instance, but the pattern they describe is broadly accepted by people who follow the institution closely. The combination of these factors. Evidentiary problems, class advantage, procedural pressure, and institutional weakness, is not unusual in Mexico. It is, in fact, distressingly common. What makes Paulette's case different is the visibility of it. What makes it the same as 1,000 other cases is the outcome. Nobody was convicted. Mexico watched the case of Paulette Guevara Farah the way Mexico watches everything it cannot stop watching. With total, sustained, often angry attention that eventually, inevitably, turns and goes elsewhere, leaving the object of its attention exactly where it was, unchanged by the watching. This is not a criticism specific to Mexico. It is a description of how media-driven public attention functions in any society with a 24-hour news cycle and a population that processes collective trauma through the organizing structure of cases, stories, and verdicts. We need the story to have an ending. We need the verdict to have been reached. When the system fails to provide those things, we tend to provide them ourselves. In March and April of 2010, every major television channel in Mexico had Paulette's case as its lead story for days. The photograph, the one where she smiles with her whole body, was on screens across the country continuously. The phrases that the anchors used, the musical stings that accompanied transitions in coverage, the vocabulary of the reporting. All of it conspired to create a narrative container that the facts, at that point, were still inadequate to fill. But the container was there, waiting. And the public filled it. The verdict reached by popular consensus was not subtle and it was not slow. Within days of Paulette's body being found, Mexican public opinion had largely identified a culprit. That identification was based on media coverage, on the demeanor of the people involved as filtered through camera lenses and editing choices, on accumulated cultural assumptions about who parents are supposed to be and what grief is supposed to look like and who is allowed to be cold in a moment that demands warmth. The verdict was gendered in ways that are important to acknowledge. The response to Lizette Farah's media appearances was shaped, at least in part, by specific expectations about how mothers grieve. A father who seems composed in a crisis is often described as strong. A mother who seems composed in the same crisis is often described as cold, suspicious, unnatural. The double standard is well documented in criminological literature on how gender affects public and institutional responses to suspects in cases of harm to children. Mothers who do not perform their grief in recognizable, expected ways are treated as having forfeited their presumption of innocence in the court of public opinion, even when the court of law has not yet had its say. None of this means that the public's suspicion of Lizette Farah was wrong. It may have been right. The question is whether the reasoning process that produced it was sound, and the answer to that question is considerably more complicated than the verdict itself. What is also true is that the coverage of the case had an enormous gender component that ran in the other direction as well. The story became, rapidly, a story about a mother. Not about a family. Not about a household. Not about an institution's failure to protect a child. A story about a woman who was either a grieving mother or a monster, with very little tolerance for the ambiguous, much more human reality that might exist between those two poles. The case also functioned, in the media and in public conversation, as a class story. La Herradura. The large house. The domestic staff. The lawyers. The resources. The ability of the family to retain control of the narrative, to some extent, for longer than a family without money could have. There was anger in the coverage about this. Real anger. The kind that comes from a society that knows, at a structural level, that the application of law is not equal, and that watches a case in which that inequality is visible, and that has no adequate mechanism for responding to it except the noise of its own outrage. The outrage was loud. It changed nothing. What happened during those 9 days between when Paulette was reported missing and when her body was found? This is a question worth answering in detail, because the 9 days are not a blank. They are filled, with searches, with media appearances, with investigative actions, with the specific texture of time passing around a mystery that should have resolved itself much sooner than it did. Day 1, March 23. The report is filed. The house is searched. Investigators find nothing. The media begins to pick up the story. The photograph circulates. The official framing is a missing child, unknown circumstances. Days 2 and 3, March 24th to 25th. The search expands. Authorities from the Estado de Mexico and from the Federal Procuraduría General de la República are both involved, which creates a jurisdictional complexity that would later be cited as one of the factors complicating the investigation. The surrounding areas of La Herradura are searched. Local residents are questioned. Security footage from nearby streets is reviewed. Nothing. The media coverage intensifies. Lizette Farah gives her first substantial television interview. The response from viewers begins to form. Days 4 and 5, March 26th to 27th. The search has now extended beyond the immediate area. Channels of the kind typically activated in missing child cases, notifications to hospitals, communications with neighboring jurisdictions, engagement with the Red Metropolitana de Alerta, are working. Tips come in. Tips are followed up. None of them lead anywhere productive. The family is under enormous scrutiny. Michel Gabarra, having returned from his trip, is present and visible and grieving in ways that are being parsed by the public in real time. The tension between his effect and Lizette's becomes a running commentary in media coverage. At the house in La Herradura, investigators continue to have access. Whether they return to the bedroom, whether they re-examine the closet, whether any subsequent search of the immediate premises occurs during this period, these details are not fully documented in the public record. Days 6 and 7, March 28th to 29th. The case has been running continuously for almost a week. In the rhythm of Mexican news coverage, this is the point at which a story either solidifies into a long-running saga or begins to recede. Paulette's case solidified. The reasons are both genuine: a missing 4-year-old with a disability, a wealthy family, a gated community where she shouldn't have been able to simply disappear, and structural, in that the story had all the elements that sustain coverage: compelling imagery, a family in crisis, an official investigation that was visibly producing no results. The tone of the coverage begins to shift. What had been coverage of a search becomes coverage of a mystery. The word "suspicious" appears more frequently. The questions about Lizette's demeanor are no longer peripheral to the story, they are becoming the story. Day 8, March 30th. It is now 8 days since Paulette was last seen. The forensic team has been through the house multiple times. The official position remains that there are no leads that have been productive. There is no suspect. There is no body. There is, officially, a missing child. Something changes on this day. What exactly changes is not in the public record with clarity. But the following day, the body will be found. By Lizette Farah. In the closet of Paulette's bedroom. Day 9, March 31st. In the morning, Lizette Farah goes to the bedroom. She opens the closet. She finds her daughter. The call goes out. Investigators arrive. The forensic team returns to a house they have been in, a room they have been in, a closet that has been opened and described as empty, and they find a child's body wrapped in the sheets of the child's own bed. How a child's body came to be in a place that was previously described as containing no such body is the question that should have produced the most sustained, rigorous, and unrelenting investigative attention of the entire case. It did not. The lawyers, the charges, and the years. After the body was found, the case entered a new phase. The missing child case became a homicide investigation. The tools available to investigators changed. The stakes changed. The legal machinery began moving in earnest. And then it moved very slowly. Lizette Farah was investigated as the primary suspect in her daughter's death. This was not, given the facts of the case, an unreasonable investigative focus. She was in the house. She was the last confirmed person to see Paulette alive. She was the one who found the body. The facts of the case described a circle of possible perpetrators that was very small, and she was in the center of it. She was detained. In Mexico, the legal instrument of arraigo, a form of preventive detention that allows authorities to hold a suspect for investigation purposes without having filed formal charges, was used at various points during the investigation. The use of arraigo in Mexico has been controversial, criticized by human rights organizations as a tool that has historically been misapplied, and the proceedings in Paulette's case were subject to those criticisms alongside many others. The legal proceedings that followed the detention were complicated by several factors. The first was evidentiary. As discussed in an earlier chapter, the forensic evidence in the case had enough ambiguity built into it that a competent defense team could create reasonable doubt on multiple points. The time of death was not fixed with precision. The chain of custody of physical evidence from the scene had been questioned. The initial search of the property had been poorly documented enough that its findings, and its failures to find, could be challenged. The second was procedural. The legal representation available to Lizette Farah was of a quality that the investigation struggled to match. This is not a criticism of any individual lawyer. It is a description of what money buys in a legal system: the ability to identify every procedural gap, to challenge every piece of evidence on technical grounds, to extend proceedings through every available mechanism, and to do so with patience and thoroughness that exhausts the resources of the state. The third was political. The case had become, by the time of the formal legal proceedings, a media event of significant proportions. Political figures in the Estado de Mexico were aware of it. The Procuraduría was aware of the scrutiny its performance was under. This kind of awareness can sometimes produce more rigorous work. It can also produce more careful performance of the appearance of rigorous work, which is a different thing. Lizette Farah was released. The case continued. Formally, on paper, it remained open. Investigators continued to have obligations. Legal processes continued to have deadlines and filings and the bureaucratic appearance of momentum. But for all practical purposes, after Lizette's release, the prospect of a conviction in Paulette's case became increasingly remote. The evidence that existed at the time of the initial investigation, which is when evidence is best recovered and best documented, had been used as well as it could be used, and it had not been enough. In the years since, there have been periodic resurgences of public attention, an anniversary, a new report, a social media campaign driven by people who refuse to let the case disappear entirely. Each resurgence recapitulates the same facts, asks the same questions, and arrives at the same absence of resolution. No one has been convicted. That is where the legal record stands. There is a way in which the case of Paulette Gabarra Farah is a story about a child, and there is a way in which it is also, inevitably, a story about women. About what we expect them to be. About what we do when they fail to be it. Lizette Farah was tried in the court of public opinion before she was tried anywhere else, and the terms of that trial were shaped significantly by gender. This deserves examination not because it resolves anything about her guilt or innocence, it does not. But because those terms tell us something about ourselves that is worth knowing. Mexico's relationship to the figure of the mother is not simple. In Mexican culture, as in many Latin American cultures with deep Catholic influences, the mother occupies a position of almost mythological significance. The language of motherhood is everywhere: maternal sacrifice, maternal love, the mother who gives everything, the mother whose love is the one reliable constant in an unreliable world. This iconography is powerful and, for the women it applies to, enormously constraining. Because what it produces is a standard against which real, complicated, flawed, fully human women are measured, and found wanting. When Paulette disappeared, the public watched Lizette Farah and found her wanting. The specific ways in which she failed to match the performance of grief that the archetype demanded. The controlled effect, the organized sentences, the tears that arrived and retreated without destroying her composure, were read as evidence of something sinister. Because a real mother, in this cultural framework, would be destroyed. would be incoherent, would be incapable of sitting in a television studio and completing a thought. This framing is worth challenging. The idea that there is one correct way to grieve, one authentic performance of loss, one real mother's response to the disappearance of a child, this is an idea that does not survive contact with the full range of human psychology. People respond to trauma in an enormous variety of ways, many of which look, from the outside, nothing like what we expect. Some people become hyperactive. Some become strangely calm. Some dissociate. Some experience a kind of numbness that the people around them read as coldness, as indifference, as guilt. The people around Lizette Farah read her composure as guilt. And it may have been. But the reading was not arrived at through careful psychological analysis. It was arrived at through a cultural reflex that says, a real mother would be broken right now, and this woman is not broken enough. That reflex has a history. It is the same reflex that has produced wrongful convictions in other cases, in other countries, in other decades. It is the reflex that prosecuted women for the death of children in their care based primarily on the fact that their grief did not perform correctly. Casey Anthony in the United States. Sally Clark in the United Kingdom. The cases are different in their specifics but share an underlying dynamic. A woman, a dead child, and a public that looked at the woman's face and decided it already knew the answer. None of this is an argument that Lizette Farah did not kill her daughter. She may have. The evidence is not conclusive in either direction, and a lack of conviction is not the same as established innocence. It is an argument that the way we arrived at our certainty, the swiftness of it, the totality of it, the cultural mechanisms it activated, should make us uncomfortable. Should make us wonder what we missed by being so sure, so quickly. And there is another woman in this story whose experience deserves attention, Esperanza Martinez. The nanny. The woman who was in that house, who cared for that child, who existed in the architecture of the household as the person most responsible for Paulette's daily physical well-being, and who was questioned and examined and ultimately released and almost entirely forgotten by the coverage once the narrative consolidated around Lizette. Esperanza is barely present in the public record. She is mentioned. Her name is known. But her account of those months, her experience of the household, her knowledge of Paulette and of what Paulette's nighttime sounded like, all of this exists in the case file in ways that the public has never had full access to. She was close to Paulette. She knew her. She was there. What she knew and what she said about it should have been central. Whether it was, we don't fully know. We need to talk about what it means to end this story without an ending. We have been here before, as readers of true crime, as consumers of stories about real deaths and real people and real systems that fail in real and devastating ways. We have learned to expect certain satisfactions from the genre. A revelation. An arrest. A conviction that allows us to feel, if not exactly resolved, at least oriented, pointed in a direction that has the appearance of justice. Paulette's case doesn't give us that. What it gives us instead is a 4-year-old who was murdered in her own home by someone who has never been held accountable, and a system that produced that outcome, and a media cycle that provided intensity without resolution, and a public that judged swiftly and then moved on, and a family in which the guilty and the innocent, whichever way that line falls, continue to exist in a world where the legal accounting of what happened on the night of March 22, 2010, has never been completed. We owe it to Paulette to be honest about what that means. It means that somewhere, in a courtroom or in a conscience or in both. We owe it to Paulette to be honest about what that means. It means that somewhere, in a courtroom or in a conscience or in both, there is an accounting that has not been made. That the person or people responsible for putting their hands on a 4-year-old girl and taking the air out of her have not, in any legal sense, had to answer for it. That the machinery we build for exactly this purpose. The prosecutors, the investigators, the courts, the entire institutional architecture of criminal justice, failed. Not unusually. Not dramatically. In the ordinary, grinding, quotidian way that it fails when money and connections and institutional weakness and evidentiary gaps align in the right configuration. We owe it to Paulette to acknowledge that she is not the only one. There are other children in Mexico, many, many other children, whose deaths are unresolved. Who never had 9 days of national media coverage. Who never had their photograph on television for weeks. Who lived in houses without gated perimeters and domestic staff and lawyers on retainer, and whose families filed reports that went into systems already overwhelmed, and whose cases produced outcomes even less satisfying than this one. We owe it to Paulette to let her be an individual and also a symptom. To understand that the conditions that allowed whoever killed her to escape justice are not unique to her case. They are structural. They persist. Every year, in Mexico and in many other countries, they produce the same result, a dead child and no one convicted. We owe it to Paulette to say her name as a name and not as a case number. Paulette Guevara Farah. Born January 12, 2006. Died in March 2010. 4 years old. She had hypotonia, which meant her body needed extra care and extra attention and extra love, and she was in a place where she should have been surrounded by all three. She smiled with her whole body. She deserved to grow up. She deserved, at minimum, to have someone answer for her death. Neither of those things happened. We have spent 15 chapters trying to understand why, and the honest answer is this: we understand the mechanisms that produced the outcome. We understand the evidentiary gaps, the class dynamics, the institutional failures, the gendered assumptions, the procedural complexities. We understand how a case like this reaches its non-conclusion. What we cannot do, and what we should refuse to pretend that we can do, is make that understanding into an explanation that makes the outcome acceptable. It is not acceptable. It never will be. The case of Paulette Guevara Farah is closed in the sense that legal proceedings eventually exhaust themselves and stop producing activity. It is not closed in any other sense. The truth of what happened on March 22, 2010, in a house in La Herradura exists somewhere, in a memory, in a conscience, in the specific knowledge of at least one human being who was in or near that room when a child died. That truth has not been spoken in any forum that produces consequences. Perhaps it never will be. That is the ending this case has. Not the one it deserved. Paulette Guevara Farah, January 12, 2006, March 2010. Cause of death, mechanical asphyxiation. Case status, technically open, no conviction. The Estado de Mexico's judicial system investigated the case for years. Lizette Farah was at various points detained and released, no conviction was secured. Michel Guevara, Paulette's father, was excluded from direct suspicion by verified alibi. Domestic staff including Esperanza Martinez were investigated and released. No person has been convicted of Paulette's murder as of this writing. Her photograph, the one where she smiles with her whole body, is still out there. Still recognizable. Still impossible to look at without feeling the full weight of what was taken from her. She would have been 19 years.